Today, we're diving into a deeply personal book by Kannaujiya. It explores a battle that, let's be honest, a lot of us are familiar with, but almost never talk about. The one that happens completely inside our own heads.
It's a pretty intense question, right? But for the author of this book, the answer, for a long time, was a definite yes. His journey really shows us how the mind can sometimes feel less like a useful tool and more like, well, a relentless enemy. These are his own words, and man, do they hit home. They just perfectly capture that feeling of being stuck on a runaway train of thoughts with absolutely no brakes. He actually has a name for this, the storm of thoughts. So, just so you know, everything we're about to get into comes directly from his incredibly intimate and confessional book. It's like part diary, part poetry, and a totally unfiltered look inside the mind of someone who overthinks.
All right, so first up, what does this internal storm actually feel like? Well, the author gives us a super clear and honestly a very relatable example of that painful feedback loop that is overthinking.
It all starts with something so small you'd think it was nothing. A single, one-word text message. For most of us, that's just a reply. But for the author, a simple okay is the tiny spark that can set off an absolute wildfire of anxiety.
And boom, instantly, the questions begin. And we're not talking about a slow, careful thought process here. This is a rapid-fire, overwhelming attack of self-doubt, where every bad possibility just piles on top of the next.
And where does this spiral of questioning always seem to lead? Yep, it almost always ends in the same place, self-blame. It's this vicious cycle where he ultimately concludes that he must have done something wrong, which just feeds the anxiety all over again.
This is where the mind really feels like the villain of the story. It's not just thinking, it's like this constant, nagging whisper that pushes him all the way to exhaustion, but never ever gives him an answer or any peace.
So a storm like this doesn't just appear out of thin air, right? So where does it come from? For the author, he traces the beginnings of this whole internal war right back to his childhood. He describes growing up in a home that was, well, emotionally cold. There wasn't a lot of affection, there was constant tension, and he basically learned that the best thing to do with his feelings was to just push them down. So he retreated inward into his own thoughts because the outside world just didn't feel safe. He calls this the childhood wound, and it's not just a bad memory. For him, it's an active, real source of pain in his life today. Think of it like a crack in the foundation of a house that makes everything else feel unstable, especially his adult thoughts and relationships. Okay, so this is where things get really intense. All of that internal pain eventually hit a breaking point. In this section, we see how the author spiraled into isolation, where that constant noise in his head drove him to some really desperate places.
At first, he was just desperate for some silence, for any escape from the storm inside his own mind. That search led him down a harmful path of coping through substance abuse, which of course just made him feel even more isolated. It got to the point where he couldn't trust anyone, couldn't build real friendships, and felt completely alone even in a room full of people.
And he makes this incredibly sharp critique of our culture here. He points out how ironic it is that we see all these trends like it's okay to not be okay, because in his actual experience, the moment he admitted he was struggling, people didn't support him, they abandoned him. And that feeling of abandonment was made so much worse by outright betrayal. He talks about how friends he actually trusted took his deepest vulnerabilities, the things he was most insecure about, and turned them into classroom jokes. I mean, after that, how could you ever trust anyone again?
In all of it, the internal storm, the loneliness, the betrayal, it all led him to his absolute darkest moment. The book is brutally honest about this part, describing how he actually started looking up ways to end his own life, because at that point, death felt more peaceful than living.
So how do you possibly come back from that? Well, for the author, the huge turning point wasn't about trying to silence his mind. It was about completely changing his relationship with it.
This right here, this illustrates the entire transformation. It was this conscious shift. He went from always worrying, what will people think, to finally asking the much more important question, what should I think? He decided to stop fighting his mind and start working with it, like a partner.
And that led him to this incredibly powerful realization. The goal was never to just erase the pain. Real healing, for him, was about understanding that pain and channeling it into something else, like writing his story. Suddenly, the sensitivity that caused so much hurt became his greatest strength.
And this brings us to the final and I think most powerful message of his entire journey. It's a lesson not about stopping the storm, but about learning how to navigate it.
This is it. This is the central metaphor for his healing. The thoughts, the worries, that whole storm, he realized it might never go away completely. But what he could do was become a really skilled sailor, learning how to navigate the rough waters of his own mind instead of just letting them sink him.
And this is his final declaration. It's a promise to himself, a promise to honor the person who suffered so much, to live for the self that made it through. It's just this defiant, beautiful act of taking his own life back.
Ultimately, the author's journey leaves us with this huge question to chew on. His story suggests that if we're brave enough to confront our deepest wounds, not as things we need to erase, but as experiences we need to understand, we can actually transform them into our most profound sources of empathy, creativity, and resilience.